When I was young, I frequented an arcade with my younger brother, who was about 8 years old at the time. I was around 12 years old. The arcade was located approximately 15 minutes from our home and featured classic games such as Pac-Man, Frogger, and Mortal Kombat, among others. While my brother favored the fighting games, I preferred a racing game. One day after school, we headed to the arcade, which was relatively crowded. The dimly lit interior was illuminated by the bright colors emanating from the games. While engrossed in my game, I noticed a man approaching my brother, seemingly intent on conversing with him. I walked over to my brother to retrieve additional game coins from him, and the man backed off and walked away. Later, I observed the man in close proximity to my games. He wasn't playing any games and didn't appear to be there with anyone. Rather, he was merely surveying the area. I became curious about the man who approached my brother earlier, so I kept a close watch on him. We spent another hour at the arcade before deciding to head home. Once we left, I noticed that the man also left and was following us from a distance of around 100 feet. Our house was about 10 blocks away from the arcade. We walked down the sidewalk and crossed a couple of streets, and the man was still following us. I told my brother to walk faster, and explained to him about the man who approached him earlier. We picked up our pace, and the man also seemed to quicken his pace. We kept looking back and noticed that he was always looking elsewhere, trying to be inconspicuous. It was unsettling to see the man following us no matter where we turned. We continued walking briskly until we saw our house in the distance, then my brother and I sprinted to our front door. Upon unlocking the front door, my brother and I swiftly entered the house, feeling much safer within its walls. However, upon noticing our parents' cars absent from the driveway, we peered outside the window, scanning for any sign of the man who had been tailing us. Not spotting him, we settled in front of the TV to watch a program. Shortly thereafter, we heard footsteps approaching the door and the doorknob turning. Assuming it was our parents, I approached the door, but upon realizing they weren't home, I panicked and ran back to the living room to alert my brother. Suddenly, we heard a knock at the window and turned to see the same man from the arcade, waving at us with a creepy smile on his face. We fled to my bedroom and cowered under my bed, while the man continued to knock on windows throughout the house. Terrified, we waited for what felt like an eternity until we heard my father return home and call out. My brother and I scrambled out from under the bed and told him everything. He phoned the police, and we recounted the events to the officers. We never saw the man again, and it remains unclear whether he was ever apprehended.
Back when I was in middle school, I lived in a quaint New England town with virtually no crime. I had just taken a babysitting course at a local hospital and landed my first gig. The house I was to babysit at was in my neighborhood and had a little girl around 8 or 9 years old and a young toddler. After the mom gave me a tour of the house, she noticed that her son's window was open and quickly shut it. She then told me to hang out with the kids while she finished getting ready. Soon after, she hustled us out of the house and to the driveway, where she revealed that most of her jewelry was missing and she had called the cops. As I stood there, about 10 cop cars came speeding in and officers with guns drawn burst into the house. I was ordered to leave, so I headed home, thoroughly terrified. It turns out that the burglar who had broken in the night before was still hiding in the son's closet, just steps away from where we were standing when the mom realized the window was open. I shudder to think what could have happened if she hadn't noticed and left me there with her 2 kids for the night. Needless to say, that was the first and last time I ever babysat.
While driving from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo in the 1980s, we had two routes to get to Ciudad Hidalgo. The National Road, or the Old National Road, which was called Milcumbers, meaning 1,000 curves. This stretch of road literally had 1,000 curves, causing many people to experience motion sickness. One evening, as we were returning to my grandparents' home in Ciudad Hidalgo, my grandfather, who loved driving on Milcumbers for its scenic views, was behind the wheel. However, since the new national road had been built, the old road had become desolate except for passing one or two small towns. As it was dusk, being on such a remote mountain road meant complete darkness with few other cars on the same stretch. After driving for about 45 minutes, the sun had set, and it was quite dark. Suddenly, my grandfather started to slow down. Sitting in the back seat behind my grandparents, I stood up to see why he had stopped. That's when I saw a large tree log blocking the road. My grandfather immediately put the car in reverse to turn around and get out of there. As we turned, he stepped on the gas pedal, causing me to be thrown back into the seat. Looking back, I saw men emerging from the adjacent trees next to the tree log on the road. They were carrying flashlights and guns, but were barely visible as the light from the car's tail lights grew dimmer and dimmer as we sped away. Thanks to my grandfather's prompt thinking and immediate action, we narrowly avoided being robbed. Since that incident, I never traveled on that road again.
The morning after a wild dorm party, I was rudely awakened by the sound of an old Western-style piano playing in the dark before dawn. Confused and annoyed, I set out to locate the source of the music. Walking alone through the silent halls, I arrived at the room I suspected was the culprit and knocked on the door, but received no response. My anger mounting as the volume increased, I pounded on the door until it cracked open briefly, revealing an overweight elderly woman clad only in underwear and a nun's hat, hurrying to shut it again. Perplexed, I returned to my bed and fell asleep. Later that day, when I returned from a project at the university, my friends in a different dorm across the street asked me about the police raid on my building that had happened earlier. I recounted my bizarre experience to them. A few days later, I noticed a piano being moved out of the same room, along with some other items. To this day, I remain clueless about the identity of the mystery woman.
I recently purchased my first house and spent the entire weekend cleaning and preparing it for move-in. After leaving the house in pristine condition on Sunday night, I returned the following morning to find a foul odor and realized someone had been in the house while I was away. Upon checking upstairs for any signs of damage or theft, I noticed that the living room window had been pushed in and was hanging off the windowsill. Realizing something was amiss, I called the police and proceeded to investigate further. As I walked towards the garage, I noticed light coming from under the basement door and called out to see if anyone was there. After no response, I barricaded the door and prepared to call the authorities. Suddenly, the intruder tried to force his way through the door, threatening and cursing me. Though he attempted to reason with me, I was too frightened to listen and focused solely on preventing him from entering the house. The police arrived and took over. While they were dealing with the intruder, I waited outside in my car. About 20 minutes later, they brought the suspect out and I got a good look at him. It was clear that he had not been sober in a long time, with a rough appearance and a foul mouth. He shouted at me as they led him away in cuffs. Over the next 2 hours, the police thoroughly searched my home for evidence of the break-in. They found cigarette butts, heroin, and handprints on the windows and assessed the damage. Meanwhile, I checked my mailbox and found a note addressed to someone named Jamie, which at first confused us all, as we have the same name, but it turned out to be a coincidence. When the police finished their investigation and left, I was alone in the house again. My realtor asked me to take some photos of the basement, where they had found the drugs. As I was taking the pictures, I caught sight of something moving out of the corner of my eye. It was a hand disappearing into the shadows beneath the furnace. I panicked and ran up the stairs, barricading the door and calling the police again. They arrived and found a second intruder, a female, who was later identified as Jamie, who had been hiding in a small gap between the furnace and the wall. The intruders had criminal histories and were charged with burglary, criminal mischief, and bail and probation violations, as well as destruction of property.
Last year, my older sister and I traveled together through Southeast Asia. While in Laos, we wanted to quickly meet up with friends in Vietnam, so we decided to hire a private driver. The driver explained that he could only take us to the Laos/Vietnam border, and that we could find tourist buses to take us to the city. Upon arrival at the border, we discovered that there were no buses, shops, or people around, and the sun was about to set. As we were looking for a way to get to the city, a group of men on motorbikes approached us, offering to take us there for $12 each, but on separate bikes. Feeling uneasy about their offer, we declined and tried to leave, but the bikers followed and tried to persuade us again. Seeking help, we approached an older couple watching TV in a nearby garage, and they agreed to drive us to the city for $70. However, the bikers followed and tried to intimidate the couple. We eventually left with the couple, but the trip took over an hour and a half, much longer than the bikers had claimed. Looking back, the thought of what could have happened if we had taken those bikes sends shivers down my spine.